The soft sound of the piano filled the air, mingling with the discreet clink of china and cutlery, so that each chord became a subtle promise of peace. I, Rebecca, stood at the edge of the room and inhaled this hour like a rare, precious fragrance, understanding that these undertones contained something almost sacred, something that drew people back to themselves and temporarily pushed aside the bustle of everyday life. For Thomas, I knew without further ado, this whisper of the piano was the sound of peace, amid a chaotic schedule of meetings, decisions worth millions, and the constant, tidal pressure to keep up. His daily lunch at this small, elegant French bistro was a sanctuary, an island of calm in his turbulent and noisy existence, a place where he could momentarily be outside of his role and within himself. The food here was impeccable, the preparation almost ritualistic, and the atmosphere warm and serene, but the real reason he kept coming back, the reason so many did, wasn't the delicately cooked fillet or the aroma of fresh bread, but the way she moved within the room. She walked between the tables with such grace that it seemed as if her every step had been rehearsed, as if in a theater where every movement had not only a function but also a meaning, and in this sense, it was the soul of the place, which you couldn't notice if you didn't know how to wait. She wasn't just a waitress, she was the heart of this space. Her dark hair was always neatly pulled back into an elegant bun, and her eyes, a deep, unbroken brown, radiated a kindness that needed no explanation or notes in a notebook, because it was in itself a confirmation of human warmth. The tone of her voice, soft, clear, brought peace, and her hands, though tired from daily work, carried the dishes as easily as a musician holds an instrument, without making any unnecessary noise. Before we continue, I want to thank you. I'm so glad you're watching this video on my channel. Please let me know in the comments if you hear stories like this. Do you remember someone in your life? Maybe yourself, someone close to you, or just a moment when everything suddenly changed. Tell me what first came to mind. He always ordered slowly, without hiding any inner need for ritual. As always, sir, I'd say, handing him his plate, and if he asked anything, it was said with that smile that seemed capable of illuminating the darkest corners of the room. I often noticed how the tension in his shoulders would melt away in those moments, leaving a rare, genuine relief on his face. Once, barely closing his eyes with pleasure, he said, "You know, Rebecca, this is the best part of my day," and this confession, simple and clear, became for me a small reward that you can't buy or put on the menu. His order was almost a ceremony, a fillet in mustard sauce, fried well, with a baked potato and a bowl of warm house red wine. And there was something akin to prayer in this consistency, something that returns a person to their body and feelings after a storm of business. Our conversations were short, professional, but always meaningful, like whips that gently freed each other from the fatigue of the day. I asked about his day, he about mine, and in these exchanges a comfortable intimacy was born, the kind that exists between those who see each other first and foremost as people, not just titles. I never saw him as the millionaire from the covers of magazines. To me, he was simply Thomas, the man at table number 7, with his own habits and little quirks, a man who liked his steak a certain way, listened to music, and allowed himself to momentarily forget the scale of the deals. And perhaps that's why he saw me not as a desk clerk with a notepad, but as someone whose smile wasn't for sale, whose kindness was a gift, not a learned formula, and there was something pure, almost rare, in this reciprocity. However, once a month, this world, assembled from small details and quiet habits, was cruelly interrupted. The tradition remained unchanged, a special occasion dinner with his fiancée, Nicole, and her parents, Andrea and Diana. The scenario was the same elegant bistro, the same tablecloths and candles. But the atmosphere transformed, as if by magic, and the air, previously light and welcoming, became thick, heavy, filled with formalities and unspoken expectations, as if gathering around the same table were not just people, but an entire system of rules demanding adherence. The first thing Thomas noticed when he arrived on such an evening was my absence. I wasn't around at these dinners, absent from the usual hustle and bustle, and always replaced by another waiter, an older, efficient man whose efficiency was unmatched by any human warmth. Once, Thomas, putting down his fork, quietly asked him where I was, and he, with a certain dryness, replied, "She's on day off." And the subject was closed, as if someone had decided that a simple explanation was the best defense against further questioning. This answer seemed incredibly unlikely, but Thomas, consumed by his desire to please his new family and avoid unnecessary conflict, let go of his doubts and immersed himself in his dinner. Nicole was elegance and charm personified, her manners were meticulously calibrated, and her smile, soft yet calculating, could disarm and reveal. And it seemed to me that he liked not so much her herself as the image she completed in his life, a subtle touch of sophistication that, in his opinion, made everything more complete. Her parents, Andrea and Diana, came with their own history and pride, which they wore like a visible badge of distinction. Andrea was a tall man with impeccable posture and a gaze that could instantly assess the value of everything that fell within his field of vision. His manners spoke of a habit of measuring the world by his own standards, while Diana appeared before me like a European matriarch, adorned with strands of pearls, with an expression of superiority, subtle and almost imperturbable. As if she had the right to judge and decide destinies by intonation, and in this combination, their presence filled the table with a special tension, which I knew Thomas accepted and in which he perhaps sought the stability provided by the monotony of status and expectations. And so the performance began, the very same one that was repeated every month with almost theatrical precision, as if someone had laid out the script in advance, assigned the roles, and measured out the lines until the last breath. "Ah, Andrea," Nicole drawled shortly after the appetizers were served, bowing her head slightly and touching a slice of cheese with her fork, "do you remember the story of our cousin in Avignon? C'est incroyable," she added with an ease that I, observing from the sidelines, always admired. Her tongue was like silk, flowing softly, and in her mouth even the simplest words sounded precious. And then, as if on cue, an invisible iron curtain of language descended, separating Thomas from the others, and the table filled with resonant, iridescent French. Standing against the wall, I could discern familiar words, but their meaning dissolved in the overall melody, transforming into something more than just conversation. It was a game of belonging, a game Thomas was not allowed to participate in. The conversation moved quickly, in waves, with smooth transitions, laughter, interruptions, light jokes, and Thomas, sitting in the center, looked lost. Though he tried to maintain a smile, all he could do was nod, occasionally raise his glass, and catch the meaning in glances, gestures, intonations. But the more he tried to understand, the further the essence disappeared from him. I saw Andrea and Diana exchange glances, barely perceptible, like two experienced players signaling, while Nicole, leaning slightly toward Thomas, barely touched his arm and softly whispered, "Don't worry, my love, it's just a family convenience. Papa is telling a story about the vineyard." Her voice sounded like a rehearsed reassurance, too even, too measured to be spontaneous, but Thomas wasn't naive. I knew that his gaze, calm and attentive, concealed the same skill that had allowed him to build an empire out of thin air, relying solely on intuition and the precision of his reading. He saw everything, the subtle glimmer in Andrea's eyes when he looked at Nicole, the way Diana's lips stretched into a restrained smile when certain phrases were spoken, and how he himself became the subject of conversation, quietly, evasively, like part of a joke that needed no translation. He sat up straight, tense, but I felt the knot of awkwardness growing within him with each laugh, the invisible noose tightening around his confidence, his breathing growing heavier. He wasn't a person to them, but an object to be observed, something of a curiosity that arouses interest, but remains alien. I remember him raising his glass and smiling slightly, as if to prove he was in control, oblivious to the hidden jibes, but his gaze, darting toward the window, betrayed an inner tension, that silent resentment born of powerlessness. A feeling of humiliation, quiet and sticky, settled in his chest like the sediment of old wine, and I understood that he endured it because he was too proud to give in. Later, in the car, the headlights flickering on the wet asphalt, he couldn't take it anymore. "Why don't you speak our language?" he asked Nicole, quietly, but with that inner ache that betrays fatigue. "I feel completely alien." Nicole sighed, long, theatrically, as if exhaling not air but patience. "Oh, Thomas," she said wearily, "you're so sensitive, it's just their language, their mother speak, sometimes the words just flow. Without thinking, it has nothing to do with you, we talk about family matters, boring, old stories, you wouldn't be interested anyway." Her voice was soft, but beneath it lurked a note of condescension that only those who don't want to see it would miss. He wanted to believe, he really wanted to. I knew how he'd gazed into her face, illuminated by the city lights, how he'd tried to catch the sincerity in her eyes, and how he'd commanded himself to believe, not to doubt, not to ruin what should be beautiful. He loved her, he was going to marry her, and there was something almost stubborn about that love, like that of a man who wants to finish what he started no matter what. He told himself that if the price of this perfect life was feeling like an idiot once a month, then maybe it wasn't so high a price. But I, watching from the sidelines, saw how the echoes of that dinner lingered in his mind for a long time. French phrases, Diana's laughter, Andrea's gestures, all of it rang in his ears, an invisible reminder that at that table he was, and perhaps always would be, a foreigner. Another city night had arrived, damp, dense, with the soft glow of the street lamps, and with it a familiar heaviness settled on his chest. It was the third Thursday of the month, which meant dinner. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, and in the reflection behind him, Nicole appeared, dazzlingly beautiful, in a blue silk dress that accentuated her eyes and slender neck. She was fastening a diamond earring, the very one he'd given her for her birthday. "Ready, darling?" she asked, her voice like soft velvet. "Always ready, are you?" he replied, pursing his lips into the smile she was surely expecting. The route to the bistro was as familiar as breathing, and the conversation in the car flowed as smoothly as the silk of her dress. Nicole talked about the wedding, the flowers, the location on the Riviera, the guest list, most of whom, as always, were distant relatives and friends from her youth, living far away but somehow meaningful, and all of this seemed superficial to Thomas, but he listened, nodded, trying not to think about how far all this was from his own world, where meaning was valued over show. Thomas simply nodded, agreeing with her words, though his gaze already betrayed an inner readiness for the familiar ceremony of approval, for the evening, where every movement, every breath, had to live up to expectations. He loved Nicole, there was no doubt about it, but I knew he hated these evenings as much as I hated the feeling of being an expensive accessory on display in the window of a glittering life. Part of the decor but not a participant in real conversation. It all happened as always. They entered the restaurant, and I, standing at the counter, caught the maitre d', his shoulders straightened as usual, immediately leading them to the same table, the best in the house, overlooking the inner garden, where the shadows of jasmine swayed in the evening lights. Andrea and Diana were already seated at the table, both holding glasses of champagne, looking like a royal couple entertaining courtiers, impeccable, composed, in the unshakable certainty that the entire world revolved around their family circle. The exchange of pleasantries was theatrically precise, air kisses, polite smiles, greetings, and behind it all lay the emptiness of a habit learned like a dance. The usual waiter, gray-haired Antoine, with his sedate politeness and heavy yet friendly face, was nowhere to be seen. In his place, a young man appeared, nervous, with an uncertain expression, approaching the table slightly hastily. "Good evening, monsieur, madame, mademoiselle," he said haltingly. "I beg your pardon, but Antoine was ill last night. I will be serving you today." Andrea raised an eyebrow, not hiding his slight irritation, and made a hand gesture that seemed to fill the air with icy indifference. "Bring us another bottle of that champagne, young man," and that was all. The conversation continued without the slightest interest in the person standing before them. Thomas felt a slight pang of disappointment, the kind that comes with the realization that even the familiar, small anchors in this ritual are disappearing. The old waiter, with whom he could exchange a few human words, was gone, and now everything was once again a faceless display case where he had to smile and nod like a doll in a display case. He was already mentally preparing himself for another night of isolation, a long, wordless one, where he would sit amid a foreign language and forced smiles, when suddenly the young waiter returned, but not with champagne, His face was filled with confusion. "Excuse me, monsieur, madam," he said quietly, "my colleague will take care of your table. She has more experience serving regular guests." And as if in a dream, I entered the room. I felt several glances on me at once, but above all, one, the most familiar. Thomas's heart seemed to take a short, uneven leap, and in that moment I realized, he was glad to see me, genuine, profound, the joy one feels at an unexpected but long-awaited return to reality. My heart also fluttered, though I tried to maintain impeccable posture and a familiar expression. The one that conceals fatigue but never reveals weakness. I greeted him. "Good evening, Monsieur Thomas, glad to see you again, and I wish you all a pleasant evening." His voice responded unexpectedly vividly. "Rebecca, what a pleasant surprise, I didn't know you worked nights." "Sometimes they ask me to cover for colleagues," I replied calmly. "It's nice to see you." Nicole, sitting across from me, looked up and glanced curiously between us, like a cat that has detected movement but isn't sure whether to respond. Her perfectly shaped eyebrow arched slightly, and she said with a hint of mockery, "Have you met?" Thomas, feeling everyone's attention on him, said, slightly animated, "Rebecca cooks my dinners here, she's the best." A warm pride rang in his voice that I hadn't expected, and for a moment the atmosphere at the table shifted. The silence seemed softer, the air warmer, and even Andrea looked up from his glass to nod slightly. I took our drink orders, as always, restrained but confident, and tried not to betray the strange nervousness welling up somewhere beneath my skin. But Thomas, an observer by nature, saw everything. I felt it, his attentive gaze, which seemed to touch me without requiring words. He noticed that my shoulders were tense, that my smile didn't reach my eyes, that it seemed more effortful than effortless. When I returned with the tray and began filling glasses, dinner seemed to have returned to its usual routine. There were phrases spoken in French, the rustling of napkins, the clink of dishes, and everything seemed to have calmed down. But as soon as I leaned over to refill Thomas's glass, everything changed. Andrea, taking a sip of expensive wine, wiped his lips with a linen napkin, turned to Diana, and said something in French, quietly, but with an expression that left no doubt the conversation had shifted to something important. His tone became serious, businesslike. "The lawyer said the news is very promising," he added, "and then something happened that Thomas, I'm sure, didn't miss." My face, calm just a moment ago, suddenly seemed to lose its color, and I felt the blood drain from my cheeks. The change lasted a split second, but Thomas noticed. I saw it in his gaze. My body betrayed what I had been used to hiding for years. The hand holding the silver pitcher trembled, the water nearly spilled, and I straightened up quickly, muttering a quiet apology without looking anyone in the eye. I walked away from the table, trying not to betray my haste, but my steps seemed too fast, too uneven. Laughter rang out behind me again, soft and melodious. Diana said something to Andrea. Nicole intervened, her voice ringing like a glass in the pit of my stomach, and French once again filled the space, light, musical, and foreign, and I, standing behind the partition, caught my breath, clutching the edge of the tray in my fingers, and tried to regain my former expression, the one that doesn't tremble when the past suddenly rises behind me like a shadow. Thomas was often alone, like an island. But that evening his attention was completely focused on me. He stood at the bar, pretending to polish glasses, his movements automatic, his gaze absent. I was pale as a ghost, and he noticed it before I could even comprehend the reason. Worry ate at the edges of his own shame. He tried to attract my attention, but I avoided looking toward their table, where dessert had already been ordered, crème brûlée for the ladies and chocolate soufflé for the men. And when I placed the plate in front of Thomas, my hands trembled, and I didn't offer the usual bon appetit. "Excuse me, I need to go to the bathroom," he said, and walked out into the hallway, where the sounds of the piano and conversation faded. The hallway was decorated with black and white photographs of Paris, and the silence there was intense, almost tangible. A few steps from the door, I grabbed his wrist. He turned, his heart pounding. And there I stood, my eyes filled with fear and urgency. "Thomas," I whispered, untitled, my voice trembling, "don't come back to this table, you need to leave here, now." He gasped, "Rebecca, what happened? Are you okay?" I shook my head and looked around, as if afraid they'd overheard. There's no time to explain, please, trust me. Trust me with what? What is it? He asked, and I interrupted him, quietly saying, my mother was French, I grew up with the language, I understood every word, they were talking about you. The words fell like dominoes, his face paled, but his voice remained firm. They were talking about me? About what? I put it briefly, not about family matters. They discussed your vulnerability, the possibilities of exploiting you, deals, risks and rewards, without compassion. My words in the empty hallway resonated louder than any threat, forcing a picture to form in his mind. The waitress who served his dinners had witnessed the plot, and the music in the hall an accompaniment to the intrigue. He tried to object, defending the world he was building, but I stubbornly looked him in the eye. Thomas, please don't come back, we don't have time, someone could ruin this at any moment. I remember one summer on the streets of Avignon, listening to my mother, smiling, explaining the subtle shades of meaning in every word, and now this knowledge weighed on me like a burden, because in the mouths of Andrea and Diana, the same words took on a different meaning, calculating and cold, not at all relatable. There was something treacherous in this thought, because language, which usually unites, here served as both a mask and a weapon, and I, standing in the restaurant, understood how easily concern could be turned into a negotiating tool. Thomas, out of habit, tried to maintain dignity and a smile, but I saw fear and pride warring within him, how he was clinging to calm as if to a thin straw, and I felt a responsibility to warn him, because the silence in their maneuvers was part of a game in which he should not become a pawn. I spoke quickly, because every minute gave the one who planned evil a chance to change their course. My voice was low, but it was filled with the conviction that a timely word could ruin the plan. I gripped his wrist tightly, feeling his skin tremble beneath my fingers, fear and pride warring within him. I understood that this moment was a choice: leave now and salvage the last vestiges of his dignity, or stay and become part of someone else's game, where the price was determined not by feelings but by profit. I wanted him to choose life, not a performance. I looked at him, and in his gaze I read a readiness for a decision. Urgent, come with me quickly. Without waiting for a word in response, I dragged him along the narrow staff corridor, where dim overhead lamps flickered like alarms, and where the air smelled not of perfume and wine, but of hot metal, garlic, and burnt oil. The metal door creaked open, and we were swallowed up by a completely different universe: heat, steam, the rhythmic clatter of pots, orders, shouts, the hum of extractor hoods, the smells of wine and roasting meat. Everything here was bustling, as if the restaurant's heart beat beyond the wall of the perfect dining room, where customers unknowingly sipped champagne to the sounds of the piano. Thomas followed me, stunned, like a man who'd accidentally peeked behind the scenes of a theater where he'd always been a spectator. Accustomed to marble, silk, and sparklingly clean dinners, he now found himself among people in sweat-soaked shirts, where everything was decided instantly. One glance, one swipe of a knife, one shout from the chef. I led him past the cooks in white hats, past assistants hurrying with trays, past clanking baking sheets, until I reached the corner where a huge refrigerator stood, its door steaming and its base stacked with fresh vegetables. Here the noise softened a little, and the steam didn't blind his eyes. I let go of his hand, but he still stood close, and I saw a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. Whether from the heat or the sudden realization that reality had shifted its mask, I could barely breathe myself, because I knew what I was about to say would prevent him from returning as the same person. They call you le faux Brazilian, I finally said, and the French words I uttered seemed to burst from my chest like poison, burning my tongue. The madman from Brazil. Thomas flinched, as if struck. I saw his eyes cloud over. How he, unwilling to believe, nevertheless understood. It explained their restrained smiles, the glances they exchanged across the table, Andrea's condescending tone, Diana's gentle but cold smile. This wasn't just a misunderstanding of the language, it was contempt, hidden behind a veil of politeness. I spoke quickly, the words tumbling from my lips, almost hissing. They raised their glasses. Thomas, they toasted the success of their plan. Jaime Vanti, Andrea said, how easy it is to manipulate you. He boasted about finding someone who believed in family so much he was blind. They laughed, they said you'd buy any fairy tale if it contained a little warmth, a little approval, a little love. I saw the words pierce him. Like glass cutting into flesh, he lowered his gaze, as if hoping the world beneath his feet would hold him up, but the ground was already shaking. I knew that right now everything was crumbling: memories, morning breakfasts, trusting conversations on the terrace, kisses that seemed sincere. All of it was turning into images that, as soon as he blinked, lost their color and meaning. What plan? He finally asked, but his voice was different, broken, as if he were speaking not from a man but from a shadow of himself. I sighed and answered, trying not to let my voice waver. The wedding, Thomas, it's part of this plan. Everything was calculated in advance. This isn't a love story, but a deal. Nicole chose you not with her heart, but with cold calculation. You were a target, not a choice. He shook his head, his lips barely moving, and I realized a desperate no was brewing inside him. He couldn't accept it. Nicole still lived in his mind, the one who touched his hand in the car, who laughed at his jokes, who kissed him with such warmth that it seemed the world stood still. I saw him reaching for an image, a memory, trying to find justification in it, but everything was crumbling like a house of cards in the wind. I stepped closer, and my voice grew firmer. They want to finalize the wedding, take you to France, to where their lawyer, Andrea's relative, has already prepared the paperwork. They'll say these are documents for the purchase of a house, a summer cottage in Provence, a wedding gift. And you'll sign them because you trust them. But this isn't a deed, it's a transfer of rights. After this, you'll lose everything. He stood motionless, as if the air around him had grown thick and thin. A look of dreadful recognition crossed his face. He was recalling a conversation in which Nicole had casually mentioned her dream of a house in the south of France, to be closer to family. It had sounded touching then, now it made sense, terrifying and simple. I looked at him, at the man who had always been able to calculate the future, but had failed to foresee the treachery around him, and in that moment, I felt not only pity, but also an uneasy sense of determination. Now everything depended on him, whether he would believe me or remain there, at the table, his life already mapped out according to someone else's script. These documents, I said, swallowing the dryness in my throat, feeling the words burn my tongue, are in fact nothing more than powers of attorney and asset transfers, structured in such a way as to give them complete control over all your major investments, real estate, bank accounts, everything you've built up over the years. They would exploit not only the language barrier, Thomas, but also your faith, your unconditional love for her, to force you to sign their financial death warrant yourself, and, like the most perverse of insults, they found a special poetry in it, to steal everything from you on your own land, using your own tongue as a weapon. When I said this, he turned pale, as if the life had been sucked out of him. The world around him seemed to disintegrate. The noise of the kitchen suddenly vanished. The shouts and clatter became distant echoes, dissolving into one endless sound, booming and high-pitched, as if awareness itself were ringing in his ears. I saw everything flash before his eyes, his memories, his smiles, his evenings, the scent of Nicole's perfume, her light laughter. It was as if he were reliving each scene, but now he saw them through different eyes, poisoned by the truth. Moments he had once considered happy flashed by, their first meeting, an accident that now seemed carefully orchestrated, her hasty "I love you," not a confession, but a trap, her interest in the structure of his companies, not admiration, but data collection. Everything he mistook for concern was predatory curiosity. Her insistence on discouraging him from hiring independent lawyers for his European cases now loomed large in his mind, as a warning sign he had overlooked. I saw his lips tremble, but no sound came. He couldn't utter a word. Everything he'd believed in had turned out to be a clever production, a carefully staged drama, where his love was merely a backdrop, and he himself a hero, unaware that the play already had a predetermined ending. The love on which he'd built his future had turned out to be quicksand, and now he was drowning in it, aware that he'd been smiling while the architect of his destruction held his hand. "Sweet traditions," he muttered, as if not to me but to himself, recalling the monthly dinners with Nicole's parents, and then his gaze clouded over. He understood, those weren't family gatherings, they were board meetings. He whispered, almost in horror, and I merely nodded. Yes, that's right, strategy sessions where he was the only item on the agenda, their project, their goal, their prize. He was the guest of honor in a play staged against him. He stepped back, leaning his back against the cold metal wall of the refrigerator, and I heard the icy breath of steel penetrate the fabric of his expensive suit, but this cold was nothing compared to what was happening in his soul. His eyes seemed to have darkened. But not from tears, it was the eclipse of reason when a person realizes that everything he believed was a lie. He looked at me, at the simple waitress, the woman who had been the only one who dared to tell him the truth. There was no contempt, no mistrust, no pity in his gaze, only a silent gratitude that radiated strength. "Why?" he finally exhaled, and his voice trembled, as if each letter were torn through pain. "Why are you telling me this?" I didn't answer right away. It took me a moment to find the words, to keep the memory from suffocating me. I looked at the copper cauldron hanging on the wall, reflecting the flames, and said quietly, "My father died for the same thing. The woman he trusted took everything from him, destroyed us, destroyed our family. He was a good man, just like you, too kind, too much of a believer in love. I see that same kindness in you. Every time you come to dinner, when you thank the waiters by name, when you look at Nicole with a trust one haven't seen in a long time. I couldn't let that happen again. No one deserves that." He closed his eyes, and I realized he was seeing her, Nicole. He was seeing her smile, the same one that once seemed the embodiment of tenderness, but now, in his memory, that smile was twisted, alien, almost predatory. The love that once filled his life was now ashes settling on his lips. His shoulders trembled, but not from weakness, from inner tension, from a struggle between pain and something else, something ancient and stubborn, rising from the depths of his being. It was determination, cold, steely, the same that had once pulled him out of poverty and placed him on top of the world. The pain hadn't broken him, it had merely turned into fuel. They had called him a fool, a Brazilian madman, mocking his trust, but now they would learn how wrong they were. I saw an icy clarity dawn in his gaze, almost terrifying in its intensity. The man who had descended from the hall had already vanished. In his place stood another, not a fiancé, not a lover, but a man ready for battle. He hadn't known the war had begun, but now he had a map of enemy territory. He turned to me, and there was so much gratitude in his gaze that I had to lower my eyes. "I have to go back there," he said, unexpectedly firm, almost calm. "I can't let them know I've figured it all out. Not yet." I caught his gaze, full of anxiety and determination, and quietly asked, "Are you sure?" Because I saw his face change, as if the pain, instead of destroying him, had forged a new being within him, cold but alive. "You don't have to face this," I said, trying to give my voice a calm I didn't feel myself. "When it would have been enough to leave, just disappear, chart a new course and let this story fade silently." And he shook his head and said briefly that leaving was not easy. They wouldn't let me go. They would find other ways, and they had already taken more than just things from him. They had taken trust and happiness, and he had no intention of giving that back. "I can't just give it up, Rebecca," he whispered, his voice freezing. "They took too much from me." The heat from the kitchen surged, and I felt the heat press into my lungs, the smell of garlic and oil, and I heard him press his fingers into his trouser pocket. "I need your help," he said, gulping. "You're the only person I can trust right now." I nodded, and he continued, as if digging the words out from deep within. "I thought you only heard fragments, but there was more." The lawyer mentioned a name, and I wrote it down on a napkin. He reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, which he handed to me as if it were a state secret, and in that instant I knew it was a thread I could pull. The name on the napkin was the beginning of their answer, the first step in a silent war. I pressed the paper to it and whispered, "This is important." "Thank you, Rebecca," he said, and there was gratitude in his voice, as deep as it was bitter. "I don't know how much this means. Be careful." "Thomas," I whispered, "they are dangerous." "I know," he replied, and for the first time that night a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "But I can play too." The return to the table was a test of willpower. Every step reminded him of his choice, and yet he walked, aware of the guests' gazes, the sounds of the piano, and the aromas of the food, which now seemed distant, like the background to someone else's painting. Nicole greeted him with a smile, but her gaze was clearly concerned. "Darling, you're pale, we were worried, are you feeling unwell?" He took her hand, the touch sent an icy chill, but he restrained himself, and a calm settled over his face, masking the storm. "Everything is fine, my love," he said quietly, "just a little unwell, it's nothing." He sat up and looked at them. Andrea and Diana's faces seemed noticeably different for the first time. Greed and complacency were evident in their eyes, and something calculating flickered in Nicole's smile. He saw them now, like a slippery surface beneath a thin layer of porcelain. I sat nearby and watched from the shadows, watching him play the role required of him. "I'm fine," he repeated, and his voice was convincing, but this time it was a role, an act, carefully and coldly prepared. Dinner ended with toasts to the future and to marriage, and Thomas raised his glass. His gaze met Andrea's, and his smile was interpreted as naive happiness, although in reality it concealed the promise of silent retribution. In those days after dinner, he became the greatest actor of his life, demonstrating loyalty and enthusiasm for the conversation about the house in France and the wedding preparations, playing along with the plan, but in his pockets there was already a secret memory. Our meetings with him became secret gatherings, carefully planned. We met in a remote cafe or on a parking bench under old trees, where no one could see us. There, we were no longer waitress and customer, we became allies, strategists, each phrase calculated. "Their language is a weapon," he said once, gazing into the steam from our coffee. "I want to understand this weapon, I want to know what they're saying." This was a chance to save everything we both held dear. Yes, by speaking. And so I became his teacher, though I barely understood then that these lessons wouldn't be just about language, but about survival, about reclaiming lost power, about restoring that inner balance that crumbles within a person when the ground is suddenly pulled out from under them. Our lessons took place not at a desk or with textbooks, but between cups of coffee, in worn notebooks and on scraps of paper, where I scribbled phrases that would become his armor. I taught him not only words but also intonations, how to deliver a threat with gentle politeness, how to smile when deceived, and how to steal the simple merci with which he uttered it. He absorbed every phrase, as if reclaiming a bit of the strength stolen from him by other voices, and each time his pronunciation cleared, I saw the old Thomas awaken within him, not the deceived fiancé, but a man capable of command and victory. He didn't learn French, he mastered the language of his enemies, turning their weapon into his own. It was a challenge, subtle and dangerous, like the blade of a knife. Meanwhile, he was putting his resources to work, and for the first time, I understood what power meant when it was invisible but tangible. Thomas called a man he hadn't spoken to in years, a private detective rumored to be capable of uncovering any secret, provided it existed in the world. "I have a task for you," Thomas said into the phone, his voice even, without a trace of emotion. "I need everything about a man named Andrea and his law partner in France, every case, every account, every shadow." He dictated the name I'd written on that very napkin and added, "Leave no stone unturned." For my part, I became the eyes and ears. Andrea and Diana's, sensing victory approaching, relaxed their caution. They continued to come to the bistro, laughing and discussing their affairs in French, as if I were nothing more than a piece of furniture. I kept quiet, smiling as usual, and yet every word they said was etched in my memory. I hid a tiny recorder in my apron pocket and turned it on while serving coffee or clearing plates nearby. Their voices were clear, snippets, bank names, transfer dates, amounts, even their laughter at Thomas's naivety. I collected these fragments like beads, forming a chain that would one day strangle its owners. Weeks turned into months, and the dossier grew. The detective sent reports, neat, cold, saturated with the cynicism of facts. Andrea turned out to be no lawyer, but a predator in a suit, with a history of scams, hidden courts, shell companies. Everything he touched turned into schemes and profit, but it was my recordings that gave these facts voice and breath. They resounded with intent, audible, the pride of criminals confident that no one would understand them. One autumn day, in a leaf-strewn square, Thomas and I sat on a bench while he listened to a recording. It contained Nicole's laughter, soft, musical, The same one that had once been a comfort to him, only now there was something different in it, a mockery, a cold joy. "It's the least a fool can do," she said, laughing with her mother. "A small price to pay for the empire he'll give us." I felt Thomas clench his fists, and the movement held everything: pain, humiliation, determination. The moment he looked up at me, I saw the pain in his heart transform into something hard, transparent as ice, pure purpose. "It's time," he said slowly, as if tasting the word. "It's time to plan our last supper." I understood him without him explaining. The finale was supposed to take place in the very same bistro where it all began, under the same lights, with the same faces. When it all happened, when the bistro doors swung open and the police entered, and the family that almost called themselves his frozen shock, silence fell, not deafening, but thick, like an autumn fog. Only a few customers remained, quietly watching from their tables, hesitant to intervene. The piano was silent, and for the first time, Thomas found himself in a place free of the false music of happiness. There was only him, Rebecca, and the invisible fragments of a life that had never truly existed, even though only yesterday it had seemed to him the unshakable foundation of everything he believed in, everything he clung to, and everything he foolishly considered his own. Thomas remained standing slightly to the side of the empty table, staring at the spot where Nicole had recently sat, still, as if the very scene of her presence had been cut out of reality with a thin blade and now gaped like a smooth, frighteningly neat hole. Her champagne cup remained half filled on the table, tiny bubbles slowly rising to the surface in the amber liquid, their crystalline movement strikingly indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded within these walls. The adrenaline that had filled his blood all night receded slowly, as if dissolving into the heavy air, and in its place a painful, viscous emptiness arose, not the sharp, searing pain of betrayal that grips the throat, but a dull, settling grief in his chest for a love that, as he now understood, was merely a skillfully painted illusion. Rebecca approached him silently, not like a waitress expected to disappear behind the kitchen door, but like someone prepared to witness and preserve a moment whose significance he had yet to fully comprehend. She said nothing, simply stood at a respectful distance, and her mere presence was like an anchor, steadying the sinking ship of his consciousness on the border between the abyss and reality. "It's over," Thomas said, not addressing her directly, but rather whispering into the space where every word echoed with a hollow emptiness. Those two words seemed to be absorbed into the walls of the room, hanging in the air like something irreversible and cold. "Yes," she replied quietly, her voice soft, yet filled with a clarity and calm he himself lacked. Thomas turned slowly toward her. The dim light of the lamps cast shifting shadows across his face, strangely suggestive of his inner hesitation, his doubts, his woundedness. He saw the strength in her eyes, not harsh or stern, but calm, kind, strong, like the roots of an old tree that had weathered many a storm. In that moment, he clearly understood the risk she had taken when she had decided to follow him, when she had interfered in the affairs of a rich and ruthless family that were not hers. She, a simple waitress, without protection or connections, had dared to tread where others would not even dare. "Rebecca, he began, but the words slipped from his tongue and hung in the air, helpless, like wisps of smoke. Ordinary gratitude seemed offensively petty here, out of place, out of proportion to what she had done. "You don't need to say anything, Thomas," she interrupted him softly but firmly, looking straight ahead, calmly, without breaking eye contact. "I simply did what any decent person must do. Decency requires no thanks." He took a step toward her, almost unconsciously, as if reaching for the warmth she exuded. "But it's necessary," he breathed, feeling the tension binding him finally crack. "You saved me not only from my money, you saved me from what I had made myself, from a life in which I willingly consented to be blind. You gave me the truth, no matter the cost." His voice wavered, breaking into a whisper, and for a few moments he simply stood there, trying to find his breath. "I feel like I've woken up from a 2-year coma." The next morning, a pale spring sun softly bathed the city, turning the streets into a wavering reflection of a new day, scented with freshness and cool air. Thomas didn't sleep a wink all night, not because he was tormented by memories, but because for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to think about the future, still empty, but ready to be filled with true colors. He didn't call his assistants, didn't open emails, and didn't give any instructions. His first stop wasn't the glass facades of expensive boutiques, but a small flower shop in an old neighborhood that smelled of earth and greenery, not polish and perfume. He chose the bouquet himself, enormous sunflowers, so bright, vibrant, and simple that they seemed to embody the very word honesty. These flowers had nothing behind a veneer of gloss, demanded no explanation, but simply were, full of light, warmth, and directness. Clutching them in his hands, he drove to the address she'd written on a scrap of paper the day before. The simple, neat building in a quiet neighborhood looked modest, but it exuded a cozy atmosphere, like a home that values peace and warmth. When the door opened, she stood before him, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair loose, soft and vibrant, without a trace of the uniform that made her part of the restaurant's service scene. She seemed younger, freer, more authentic. Her eyes widened momentarily when she saw the bouquet, and the corners of her lips twitched into a sincere, quiet smile. "Sunflowers," she whispered, a surprised joy in her voice. "I didn't know," Thomas replied, lowering his gaze slightly. "They just felt right." She stepped aside and invited him in. The apartment was small but bright, and every detail spoke not of status but of the person who lived there. Books on the shelves, pots of herbs, a soft blanket left on a chair. There was no glitter, no gilding, no cold gloss, only warmth, real and alive. They sat in the small kitchen, and sunflowers placed in a tall pitcher filled the space with sunlight. Thomas sipped hot coffee and caught himself in a strange feeling, as if in this house, in this silence, for the first time in a long time he was in a place where he truly felt good. Not because someone expected him to say the right words or make the right decisions, but because here he didn't have to be anyone but himself. I always watched him during dinners, when he didn't yet truly notice me, didn't see me as a living person behind the trays of porcelain plates. I, stealing furtive glances at him, spent long periods capturing the subtle movements of his hands, the reserved gestures, that special look in his eyes when he was lost in thought. And it seemed to me that there was some invisible silence around him, not belonging to this noisy, glittering world. "You looked lonely," I admitted, playing with my cup, sliding my fingers over the warm porcelain as if the right words were hidden within. "Even when you were at the top, when everyone around you strove to be near you, your loneliness had a weight, almost physical. You could feel it on your skin." He listened without interrupting. And for the first time I allowed myself to be completely honest, not hiding any emotions or memories. "When I heard them speak of you, with that cold disdain with which they lazily admire their power, I felt an anger I didn't expect," I said, my voice firmer than I'd intended. "To them, your kindness wasn't a strength, but a weakness, a chink in your armor that could be penetrated, explored, exploited. But I saw your true strength in it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't blindingly brilliant, but it was real." These words, simple, unadorned, touched him deeply. I saw it in the way his gaze changed, softer, quieter, warmer, as if I'd touched not his hand but something far more fragile and hidden within. No one, not even Nicole, saw the man behind his wealth, behind the luxury, behind the whole facade he'd erected for years to keep anyone from getting too close. The alliance born that night amid the rubble of a shattered illusion slowly began to transform into something else, not a turbulent, blinding feeling, but a deep, calm current that required no grand words. Gratitude turned to respect, respect gradually flowed into admiration, and admiration into a quiet, natural affection that needed no confirmation. We began to meet not in the glittering halls of restaurants or at dinners where every word was calculated, but in parks, where leaves crunched underfoot, and in museums on free admission days, where the paintings spoke for us what had not yet been said. We went to an old movie theater showing classic films, and there, in the dim light, I heard his laughter for the first time, not the forced one he once used to greet his partner's jokes, but a lively, genuine laugh. Thomas suddenly discovered the joy of simple things, things that can't be bought, conversations without subtext, unscheduled walks, silence that requires no explanation. He talked to me about his fears and hopes, Recalling the boy he once was before he built his empire, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, and I listened as one listens to something very precious. One day, he asked me to continue teaching him French. The language that had previously separated him from me like a transparent wall became our shared, secret space. We laughed at his mistakes, and I wrote words for him on napkins, not bills or lawyers' names, but simple expressions: mon coeur, ma joie, mon amour, and there was no falsehood in these words, only a bright, warm intimacy. Several months passed. One warm autumn night, he called me, and his voice sounded quietly joyful, almost boyish. "I know a place," he said, and I immediately knew where he wanted to take me. As we entered the familiar bistro, I felt time come full circle. Everything around us was the same: the creaking floorboards, the smell of freshly baked bread, the soft glow of the lamps, and yet completely different. We were no longer sitting at a huge table, cut off from the world and from each other, but settled in a corner where we could speak quietly and still hear everything. When the waiter approached, Thomas looked at me, and a confident, calm light gleamed in his eyes. He ordered our favorite dishes and a bottle of fine wine in flawless, fluent French. The waiter raised his eyebrows slightly, not mockingly, but respectfully, and departed. I looked at him through the soft candlelight, and my eyes, as he later said, shone as if the entire evening were reflected in them. "Your pronunciation is impeccable," I said, smiling openly. "I had the best teacher," he replied, reaching across the table to touch my palm. This touch was different from that first evening, when everything had been filled with cold confusion. Now it was warm, electric, a quiet promise that required no words. "I wanted to come here today," he said, "to replace a bad memory with a good one, so that this place would become not the stage of an end, but a beginning." He raised his glass, and I did the same. "To a life without lies," he said. "To the truth," I replied, and our glasses touched softly, almost in a friendly manner. The sound that filled the restaurant was neither a signal for war nor an echo of betrayal. It was the first note of a new music, our music together. Quiet, sincere, and real.